And I also want to welcome our guests in the audience here tonight. You have kind of heard a little bit of the behind the curtains introduction of our lecturer today, Professor Nuno Garupa from George Mason University in the United States. And as advertised, we are going to talk today about high courts in global perspective. And the idea for this workshop or for this talk was brought about by the book that he co-edited with a couple of his colleagues. And the title of the book is High Courts in Global Perspective. And just to start our discussion today, I want to say that our everyday lives, both as students and professionals of the law, practitioners of the law, our everyday lives are defined by constitutional and political discourse that is heavily burdened with different narratives and different approaches on how different high courts should operate in the different states. We can think about Romania, Poland, Hungary, the United States. And certain of these messages are almost deeply embedded in our subconscious. We hear them so much. But beyond these messages, at the intersection of law, economics, and social sciences, as the subtitle for today's discussion suggests, how can we and how should we look at the work of these high courts? This is what we are here to discuss today. And out of the many aspects that the book describes, I just want to focus maybe on one, the empirical testing of certain ways and means chosen to establish high courts. The book methodically looks at different case studies from the US, state and federal jurisdictions, New Zealand, India, Central and Eastern Europe, and it also reflects on the work of the Court of Justice of the European Union and the European Court of Human Rights. And in this context, and maybe this is going to be a good idea to start our discussion with, I found a reference in the book that paired Pakistan, Venezuela, Hungary, and Poland in a group. And at first sight, this pairing might seem like strange bedfellows, as the saying goes. In what aspect can we say, though, that these countries and their high courts belong into the same group? This would be the first question that I would address to you, Nuno, as our guest. And please, if you can elaborate on this a little.
So thank you for having me. And I will go to your exact question, although pretty sure that's not my chapter in the book, because my chapter does include Poland and Hungary, but does not include the other countries. But before I get there, let me just one brief sentence about the book, and then I'll get there. So I think the book has came out two sort of big questions that people were having. First, as you said, there are different chapters about regions and countries. And one reason for that is because nobody was sure what sort of work is being done in different countries and regions. Of course, a lot of this stuff is done in the US and English-speaking countries, and people are sort of familiar with that. But then what happens in other countries, in national languages, nobody really knew. So the book is a try to attempting to get sort of an overview. And the second is a bit what you're already asking is, I mean, a lot of people do comparative, and comparative is fashionable now. I mean, we have the rise of comparative constitutional law. We have, of course, comparative law, but we have many other areas of comparative judicial politics, comparative governance. The word comparative has become sort of a very famous and trendy word. But of course, one of the problems is what are we comparing and how we compare. And so one of the issues we had here is how do we compare data? I mean, people are using this data to make comparisons. And that's where I'll get to the question that Martin was asking. And let me preface that question by saying, one of the things I was a bit surprised at some point when, I've been in the US for a long time, but I'm native from Portugal. When we had the austerity program imposed in Portugal by the European Union, is at some point the European Commission had a report saying that one of the problems we had was that Portugal has one of the most activist constitutional courts in the European Union. And of course, my reaction to that sentence was, how do they know that, right? I mean, how do we know that? Has anyone measured that? I mean, how does the European Commission decide that we are one of the most activist constitutional courts? Of course, you know, we can understand why they're saying that, because they were upset that the Constitutional Court was invalidating the austerity measures. But that's a different answer to the problem. So that gets to the same, why would Hungary and Poland be in the same group as, I guess, Pakistan and Venezuela? And we can see where that's coming from. That's coming from the rule of law indicators, I'm pretty much sure. And that raises questions, which we can go over in this discussion, which, A, what are we measuring with those things? How do we measure rule of law? And then are these metrics really measuring rule of law? And even if they are, how are we making these comparisons, right? I mean, remember, many of these measures, for example, are perceptional. So how can we compare perceptions of the Hungarians with perceptions of Venezuelans or Pakistani, when in fact it's different cultures, different societies? And I think the book, in particular, the final chapters, really wants to move into this discussion about how we compare. But I think before we get there, we have to understand what we are measuring first, and how we are measuring, and what is the goal of measuring. And I think these are all questions that I'm pretty sure we'll have time in this discussion to go over, because I think this is tricky in my view. This is very tricky because I think this is increasingly popular, not just with the World Bank and the IMF, or even the European Commission or the OECD, where they measure everything and they use these measurements. But even in a lot of academic work, it's becoming trendy to use measures. And I think a lot of the discussions have to be what exactly are we measuring, and how are we showing, you know, certain aspects over other aspects of high courts, and in this case, you know, constitutional review. And I think I'll stop here and, you know, let's start the discussion.
Absolutely, and I think we can save the best for last. The coming back to the rule of law towards the end will tie the discussion in a nice bow. And based on what we discussed previously when we were preparing for today, firstly, we agreed that we should talk a little bit about structures in terms of how high courts are built, what can be said or measured about their composition. And I think judicial governance is something, or the judicialization of politics is something that we always hear these days. It's a widely used, I could say, magic word. But do we really know anything about the significance of high courts when we talk about judicial governance? And can we somehow measure that these high courts have become more emphatic, more significant players in their respective legal systems? Is there any corroboration for this in what I could call hard data? And some of what the book describes is about this issue. So I'd like to ask for your opinion on this.
I mean, I think there are general trends that you can use certain types of measurements to do. I mean, let me give an example. Right now, for example, in terms of public trust on courts, I mean, usually on the Supreme Court or on the Constitutional Court, we're not exactly the same position we were 25 years ago, in Europe for sure, because now we have Eurobarometer's data going back 25 years. We have European surveys going back to 25 years. So there's a lot of things we can say, looking at raw, hard data, as you're saying, that we couldn't 25 years ago. And so that's an important aspect of this discussion, is that there is a lot of good data. We can do that. There's also a lot of efforts out there. I mean, I should say, although I actually cite in my own chapter in the book, I'm not a big fan of CEPEJ, right? The Council for Efficiency of Justice of the Council of Europe, because I think a lot of the data they use is really problematic, and they make comparisons across European countries, which I think are problematic. I mean, when they compare civil litigation in Hungary with civil litigation in, say, France and in Ireland, obviously, if you don't contextualize the data, you don't really know what you're comparing, because the laws are different, the litigation strategies are different, the courts are different. So we have data. I think we have questions about how this data is being worked by different social sciences and how people do that. But on other things, we actually have very, very limited data. And a lot of some of the discussions we still have are based on salient cases. Now, I am not, I'm an economist by background. So I'm not saying we all have to do quantitative regressions and everyone has to learn Statistics 101 and that we should make Statistics 101 mandatory in law degrees. Even at Mason, we make it elective. So people do not really have to endure the pain of having to go through basic statistics. Having said that, I think it's fundamental people have some understandings of the way these things operate, because a lot of discussions are just salient cases that we don't know if they're representative, we don't know what we're talking about. And then people say, well, we have 4 cases in Hungary where this has happened, where in Germany we had 2 cases. Well, how do we know these are really representative samples? Why are we making inferences about these different cases? And finally, I think there's a need for social scientists, and I would include lawyers within social scientists, law professors, to understand that one thing is to want to measure and use measures to sort of address structural problems, as you say, right? I mean, let's see, is there really more judicialization of politics? Do really constitutional courts are invalidating more statutes now than they were 20 years ago or less? I mean, is that really what we're going on? And of course, we can measure that, and but on the other hand, we also have to understand that, it's well known that if you torture the data enough, the data will confess anything you want. So you can, you should not always go into the opposite direction. Like say, okay, we'll rely on data because the data will give us all the answers. And what I mean by that is we need to have good theory. We need to have good doctrinal approaches to law in order to have a sense of what we're looking for. Otherwise, we will basically be driven by data. And being driven by data has this problem that the data will tell you whatever you want the data to confess. The example I usually give, it's unrelated to high courts, but it's the example here in the United States, is, as you know, there's a huge controversy over the deterrence effect of the death penalty. And if you think about it, right now, there are about 100 studies in the last 40 years. And half of them find a deterrent effect, half of them don't find a deterrent effect. And even within the deterrent effect, they go from saving 0.3 lives to saving 35 lives for each execution, which is a huge variance. Now, what we do know is that there is a very high correlation between the results of these papers and how the authors are registered as Democrats or Republicans as voters. And so I'm not saying people are being fraudulent or that people are being led by ideology. But I am suggesting that ideology constrains the way we look at the data, and that can have consequences for how we use data, even in these discussions about high courts.
Absolutely. And I saw some of the eyes in the audience have a glimmer when you mentioned representative samples. Our law students here in Hungary have a compulsory education in statistics as part of their legal curriculum. So they really do enjoy looking at numbers, and they know all the pleasure that comes with it, obviously. But whatever you said about the inherent bias that comes with the ideology of the beholder, looking at the numbers obviously is certainly something that is relevant. I talked about magic words when I mentioned judicial governance previously. Another magic word is judicial independence. And a lot of the current debates, especially in Europe, regarding the efficiency of justice is about judicial independence, both in political sense and also in a legal sense. For example, we could consider the Polish example regarding the ongoing judicial reforms. And is there any sort of a quantitative method, this would be the question, that would be reliable enough to have any kind of political consequence attaching to it in a way that it would lead to reforms? And also to formulate the question in a different way, can judicial independence be quantified? And if yes, is this enough or is this even necessary? This ties a little bit to what you have previously said, but it has a different focus, more specific focus.
So I think the first problem is in order to measure judicial independence, we need to define judicial independence. And as we start that discussion, that would be another seminar. And I'm sure, I mean, if we have 5 people in the room, we will have 10 different views about what judicial independence means. So the first problem is, it's one of those things that everyone uses, those words, a bit like activism and rule of law, all those buzzwords and judicial governance, all those buzzwords. But when we sit down and try to define, people have very different views. In my, you know, there are some measures of judicial independence, of course, by now. Some of them are by scholars in Europe, and people make distinctions between de facto and de jure judicial independence. But of course, you know, there's some aspects here that one needs to always consider. First, everything is contextual, right? I mean, when people say they're very upset about the Polish reforms, on the other hand, nobody was really upset until, and nobody's really upset, and was not even upset before the constitutional reforms in the UK, that the judges were appointed by the Prime Minister, the Lord Chancellor and the Prime Minister. I mean, that's a straight political appointment. There's no sort of, any sort of balance or separation of powers there. Now, the reason was that because the convention was that, you know, there are 2 or 3 parties in the UK, and so the appointments will reflect those 2 or 3 parties. So that's a contextual variable that has nothing to do with judicial independence. It has to do with the competition of the party system. So that shows that the first problem we have is that all of these measures will be contextual. And actually, on the UK, it's very interesting that there's these big studies by Schleifer, the LLSV studies to the you know, on legal origins, where they have these studies on judicial independence, and they go and try to argue that common law judges are more independent than civil law judges. And of course, they stumble in the UK case, because it's like, oh, you know, how can we justify that they have more independence when they're directly appointed by the Lord Chancellor and the Prime Minister? So they simply take them out and say, okay, we're not going to consider the UK because it doesn't fit our story. And of course, I mean, it's a problem of context. Second problem, I think the problem with judicial independence is that people in these discussions, in particular, tend to forget the other side, which is judicial accountability, right? I mean, you know, having people completely independent would mean, why don't we have judges throwing coins when they make decisions? That's totally independent. It's purely random. What more independence do you want? They're not independent from anything except luck. Well, that would certainly create certain accountability problems if we have a justice system based on coins. So that's the other problem. The third problem I see, just to mention, is the studies I've myself done with some political scientists also show that the way people think about these topics varies depending on what is the significant perception we have about justice. So what we find in Europe is that a large part of public opinion does not care about judicial independence when judges are perceived to be incompetent, unable, huge backlogs, cases take forever. Only when it gets to a threshold of some efficiency, some effectiveness, it depends on what you would call it, then there's some awareness about the independence problem. And so I think people talk about judicial independence as if judicial independence would mean the exact same thing, say in Europe or in Africa or in Latin America. It cannot mean the same thing because the problems that these judges are facing are tremendously different and the context is different. Now, do we want to have metrics that will make worldwide comparisons? Ideally, yes, that's what the World Bank gives us and the world governance indicators give us. But do we want to really use them literally to say that a country has more judicial independence than another based on that measure? I would be very skeptical. And I think I would say we have to contextualize all the analysis. So even taking cases in Europe, and to be sort of going to the point that I know it's always an issue, is the fact that on a particular metric, Hungary goes down or goes up when you move from 2019 to 2021, I would not make that a huge thing. I know in Europe, this becomes huge things because one country goes up 0.2 and the other country went down 0.4. I think that's just a ridiculous way of understanding these metrics and these measures, given, you know, given the margins of error and given the problems of these measurements. Now, if you tell me that Hungary by now has an indicator that's 25% of the indicator 10 years ago, that's a different story. Then I think, okay, we have to sit down and understand why this is happening, because you went down 75%. But to go down 0.2 or 0.3, and then the European Union or the Council of Europe comes up with these reports where people are changing 0.2 or 0.3, I think this is just ridiculous. And I think that's actually the bad job with data, to be honest.
May I jump in with a question, actually? So what would be your take on comparison among countries or between countries, or comparison on large scale? Because it seems to me that it is almost impossible, because you are referring to the context and you cannot just pick out some cases from the context, because this is your point that without considering also the context, you cannot compare. But it makes actually impossible comparing huge data sets. Is that the case, what you are arguing for?
So that's actually what the book is about. It's about how do you compare big data sets. And so I think the book gets into what you're saying. It starts by saying, at the moment, these comparisons are highly problematic. And so the way to move forward is we have to change methods on how to do these surveys and these comparisons. And the last book is exactly about, the last chapter of the book is about that, how to develop methods to make these comparisons. And let me go back to the example we're discussing. I mean, if we look at, say, the World Bank rule of law indicator, which is published every, 2 years now, I still think it's an indicator that, of course, we should look at. But to a large extent, it's benchmarking each country to some ideal that's approximated by, the old sort of Anglo-American view of what rule law should be. Now, if you're not doing well there, it just means you're very different from, say, the United States. If that's problematic or not, then I think it's contextual. I mean, Iran does very bad on these rankings, really bad. Do I think Iran has rule of law in the Western sense? I don't think so. So I think the indicator is correct. Do I think Iran does not have rule of law in the way they understand rule of law within their Sharia law model? I think that's wrong. I mean, I think Iran has a different view of understanding what rule of law means. And so I think we have to, when I say contextualize, we could say we went to benchmark. Okay, we are benchmarked against whatever this ideal, this Anglo-American ideal. That for me is an interesting measure, but I don't think you can read it literally as meaning, oh, if you don't look like us, then you're wrong, you're very different, and there's something wrong about you, which to some extent has been, the interpretation of the World Bank or the IMF of these comparisons. And so what I'm contesting is the interpretation. Is the interpretation they make of these indicators, not collecting these indicators, because I think there's still some useful information there.
So you talked already a lot about contextual determinants and indicators. Obviously, local knowledge of the systems that we look at is very important. Numbers don't always tell the truth in this sense. But should we understand this in a way that any backing in statistics or hard data that would push for, I would say, large-scale reform of the high court system in a country, let's say suggesting a switch from a dual system that has a constitutional and a Supreme Court towards choosing only one of them and maintaining those, are these approaches straying from the right path? If you can understand.
So I think that's I think that's a very good question, because, for example, if you pick some of the studies done there, the conclusion actually tends to go the other way around, that dual systems do better than systems with only one court. But here's the problem, and that's where we start. That's why I say we need to be careful about our own ideological biases in these things. And I would say technocratic biases rather than ideological. Because people were educated in the German system think the dual system is great. People who were educated in the American system think having one Supreme Court is great, and that's a technocratic bias, fundamentally coming from where you were educated. But here's the problem: when you look at the data and you start doing this, and there's a few papers by Stefan Voigt about this, he comes up with the conclusion that the dual model does better. Why does the dual model does better? Because when you start looking at the data, most of the countries that have one court, the Supreme Court, are actually in the American continent. It's Latin America. Well, the problem is Latin America is not really known for having the most efficient and the most effective court system. So you start having a problem that you don't really have counterfactuals. I mean, you don't have the Germany with the dual model and the Germany with one court. And then let's compare and see which of the two Germanys actually does better. You have to create these two Germanys statistically. And when you start doing this, unfortunately, that's not as easy as trying to do that for inflation or unemployment or other macro variables that we already have a lot of econometrics to do that. And so that's why I emphasize, I'm not saying the studies are rubbish and that we should not look at the studies and we should tell Stefan Voigt, go home, this is rubbish, I don't care about this because this is really bad econometrics. I'm just saying, let's be careful because when you're doing this, you don't have a random sample of countries with both models, right? And so because you don't have a random sample, it's actually a biased sample. Some of the conclusions you should not read as saying, oh, the dual system is always much better than the other system or vice versa. That's what I'm trying to emphasize. I'm sorry if that's bad news and if people would prefer to say, oh, I go to the doctor and the doctor gives me a recipe and I just have to implement it. Having said that, I am not opposed, particularly in our context of the European Union, I'm not opposed that the European Commission and some of the other institutions use this sort of data to provoke, certain types of discussions. Well, I'm very skeptical, and again, coming from Portugal, we had the same thing with austerity, because some of the reforms on the Portuguese courts were imposed by the IMF and the European Union, and they were very naively grounded because they were grounded on misperceptions about the data. And I think it has to be informed by a larger discussion. That's what I'm saying, and I think that's good news in a way for lawyers, because I'm saying for lawyers, there's a role for you. Even if you don't like the data, even if you hate the data, there's a role for you, because I don't think the data will give all the answers that the policymakers want to hear.
Absolutely. I think we can all agree that is absolutely right. Before we go into further discussions on judicial roles, behaviors, just one question maybe, because we talked a lot about comparing national courts and contextual determinants, but we should also address the work of international courts and how they perform. And the book also has a chapter on the ECHR and the Court of Justice of the European Union. What are the main challenges in measuring this performance of international courts in your experience? And are there any quantitative methods that would help in analyzing this performance?
So in international courts, I think there are two sort of groups of studies. One is probably I want to say easier, but less conceptually problematic, which is a lot of people, what they want to study is the extent to which different cultures lead to different sorts of behavior in the court. That is, the question is the Hungarian judge in the ECJ very different from the Greek judge? And is that a reflection of Hungarian cultural and legal norms versus the Greek cultural legal norms? And that's sort of some of the studies out there. I mean, I'm saying the ECJ could be applied to, of course, the European Court of Human Rights and so on. And so that's sort of culturally driven. The big concern is culture, how to measure culture, cultural influences. And, in things like, of course, in the ECJ, there are no dissents, but in courts where dissents, I mean, is dissenting behavior a function of culture, a function of your experience, a function of how people are recruited, because some countries recruit law professors, other countries recruit career judges into these courts. Does this make a difference? The other area, which I think it's trying to sort of blossom now, is more, what is the role of these international courts and can we measure it, right? So is the European Court of Justice a counter-majoritarian court against the European Commission, or are they an ally of the European Commission, right? And these are two theories out there. that the role of the court is to be counter-majoritarian, they should be checking the commission, and they should be sort of invalidating decisions by the commission. The other theory is no, they are, they should be allies of the commission in building this European Union law as a different legal system, and we need this. The problem with this sort of questions, I think they are broader, of course, and probably more exciting for many people in the room. The problem is, again, how are you going to measure that? So I already just mentioned invalidation of directives and regulations. Is this a good measure? So if we find that European Court of Justice invalidates 10%, is this telling us something? But if it's 50%, is it telling us something different? And I think people very, very fast will have different explanations. If we discover the ECJ is much more, again, much more invalidating in antitrust law, say, rather than other, say, business law or other policy areas, should we read too much into that? Should we be saying, well, it's because they care less about antitrust law and they care more about other areas of the law, or vice versa? And I think the answer to those questions, it's much more controversial, because I think you don't. I mean, there's a lot. We need a lot of theory, a lot of understanding of the role of the European institutions before we can actually start looking at this data more seriously, at least in my view.
Applying social science or methods of social sciences are not very much popular in Hungary still among legal scholars, to tell the truth. And your argument seems to be in line with the general skeptical view in that regard, because you are arguing that there are limits, of course, applying social science methods and analyzing legal issues or even judicial behavior of the courts or decisions of the courts. So you are emphasizing that there is a limitation for social scientific methods, actually. But at the end of the day, what would be the added value if we apply social sciences? So what is on the positive side of the story? Because it's getting more and more familiar. I mean, in Hungary, legal scholars are getting more and more familiar with some kind of application of social science methods. But at the end of the day, what would be the added value of this application, actually?
I think the added value is that there are a lot of things that the evidence and the measurement are very, very useful. And in my own work, we have exposed with data things that without data will not be exposed. For example, there was a huge controversy in Portugal about the behavior of the Constitutional Court during the austerity, where they said the judges were deciding cases on the basis of ideology, not of legal doctrines. And therefore, the court was behaving as a political chamber for this case. Well, what we showed, for example, with data, is this is not accurate, that the rate at which they were disagreeing or doing any of the things they were doing was not very different from the periods before austerity and not very different from the periods after austerity. And so this sort of evidence changed the discussion, because it's not true that it's the austerity that is causing this. I mean, if you're upset that there is too much dissent, well, dissent always existed. And so that's a different discussion. So I think a lot of evidence and a lot of these methods are useful. And in fact, I'm advocating all the time that we should be applying them. And also because I believe that a lot of our discussion as academics has to be perceived as a cascade of knowledge. I mean, we are creating a cascade of knowledge with more knowledge and more knowledge. It's good you asked me this question, because I do want to emphasize that, in my view, the limitations, where I see the limitations, is when you jump from the cascade of knowledge, from the evidence, into clear positive policy prescriptions. When you say, okay, based on this, we should be doing that. That's where I'm skeptical. But before we get to that stage, I think data and the use of social science methods is important, because I think a lot of discussions, you cannot really get an answer without, let's go and test and see the evidence. And we know that. I mean, even in what people sometimes are less comfortable, the rational choice theory, a lot of the limitations of the rational choice theory, we know now, it's because people went and test many things with experiments. And now we know people have all these different biases and all these different limitations. So I do think we need these methods to get evidence, to get knowledge, to understand what's going on there, to make it, reflect on that. Where I'm slightly less enthusiastic is to move fast from that sort of approach to let's prescribe policies, let's do this because this will solve the problem. That's where I'm more skeptical.
Did I understand it correctly that your study on the austerity measures, I mean the striking down austerity measures by the Portuguese Constitutional Court, so your study had changed the direction of the discussion on the Portuguese Constitutional Court's behavior? Is it really true that it had so deep impact on the discussion on the behavior of the Portuguese Constitutional Court?
Well, in the academic sense, yes. Not in the political sense, because in the political sense, we just changed government. And therefore, as you know, when you change government, the problem is over. And so nobody cares about this anymore until the next time. So in the political, no, we had no impact because nobody cares about this anymore. But in the academic discussion, yes, because a lot of the law professors that took the view that the court was being overall politicized because of austerity really changed their mind and said, well, maybe we have a different problem. That's not what's going on, because the data was very strong in this. No, there's no change. I mean, this is the same sort of praxis that they had before. It's just that now you're paying attention. You were not paying attention before. And I think that message went across, that the problem is now you should pay attention all the time.
Mm-hmm. Maybe just one question for our audience also to clarify. The book calls this approach high court behavioralism, looking at judicial behavior and court behavior. What does this mean, though, in detail, high court behavioralism? How could you contextualize the approach for our audience as well?
So that's why, because we wanted to encompass different approaches. I mean, not all scholars, as usual, agree on what behavior at the high court means. And there are two sort of different issues here. Some people, like me and anyone in the audience trained as economists, we are all educated into the rational choice model. So we think people are very rational and do cost-benefit analysis. People come from psychology have very different views, and from sociology have some different views about this. So we wanted to have a word that everyone feels comfortable, rather than excluding any of the approaches. The other problem is also a big challenge because we have a sense that judges have individual behavior, but that the behavior of the court is not just the sum of individual behaviors. I mean, there's some interactions. And so we wanted to use a word that really means both things: individual behavior of individual judges, and then this meso level, where essentially we're talking about the behavior of the court as if the court is a him or a her, when in fact the court is an institution. And so there's some need to explain why we go from individual behavior to this meso level sort of behavior. And we know in law this is useful. People say the court did this, the court did that. Well, not really the court, because the court as a court, it's a composition of individuals, but we all have a sense that that composition of individuals is not just the mere aggregation of individuals, because of course there's peer pressure, social norms, interactions. And so we wanted to use all these sort of concepts, and that's why we call behavioralism. So I would say it's a general inclusive concept rather than excluding certain social sciences or certain theories out of the picture.
Anyway, you try to explain judicial behavior, actually, or behavior of the court, even if it's a composite one, I mean, you can explain it from different perspectives, but are there any promising quantitative methods which you would highlight that is really promising in explaining judicial behavior? So is there any kind which is the best one, I mean, you could choose? Or it depends once again on context, or on what is the research question, of course, or anything else?
Well, you know the answer to that question. My method is the best, obviously. No, seriously. I think there are different methods. I think a lot of people choose methods as a function of their background, right? I mean, I'm an economist, I do regressions. A lot of sociology is about qualitative work. So people do surveys, interviews, and they work on qualitative evidence. And so I don't think there's one single method. I do think for some questions, you might have some specific methods being more appropriate. But I do think there's, let me give you an example where I think it's clear why the choices of methods is, and the level of what we're doing is sort of a problem. And the example I give is the Obamacare, right? The Obamacare, as most of you remember, got through the court by 5-4, right? But the surprise was that Chief Justice Roberts voted with the Democrats to uphold the Obamacare. Now, if we pick individual estimations and we use the sort of attitudinal model, which is the model that says judges are just ideological, can we predict the outcome? No, because we had 5 Republicans, 4 Democrats. So the outcome, the predicted outcome would be Obamacare doesn't go through. It went through. However, it actually predicted 8 of the 9 votes because 8 justices voted according to the model. Unfortunately, Chief Justice Roberts. That's the problem in our estimation. But here's an example where, do I think it's a good model? Do I think it's a good method? Well, it predicts 8 of the 9. That's good. But on the other hand, it didn't predict the outcome. That's bad because I want to predict outcomes, right? So in some situations, if you're just trying to predict judges, that would be fine. I mean, you just want to show that one judge is Republican and the other is progressive. That's fine. The method will work. If I want to predict outcomes, and I'm guessing lawyers in the room want to predict outcomes, because what I want to know is if I win or lose, not really who votes for whom, then of course it's not a good method. So I think the methods will depend very much on which question you want to answer and which sort of variables you're looking. And I think that will depend on, again, on the researcher, on the scholar, but also on the questions.
Mm-hmm. And is there any connections between normative arguments and any kind of quantitative research? So can a normative argument be based on quantitative methods which underpin or support a certain kind of normative thesis? Is there any kind of connections, or quantitative methods are rather neutral in that sense?
So I think you can have 2 answers to that question. One question is, we should run away from normative arguments, right? I mean, we should always be positive. Let's just say it's neutral. But I think that's not, that's a way to sort of protect myself when I give seminars, right? Okay, I'm not being normative. I'm just saying this is happening. I'm not taking sides on if this is a good thing or a bad thing. But I think it's complicated, as you're saying, because I think one of the problems is, first, some of the normative arguments are intrinsically quantitative. I mean, if we're going to use as a normative argument efficiency, we can measure efficiency. So that's intrinsically quantitative. If the argument is going to be about cost-benefit analysis, that's intrinsically quantitative. But that means we're already making some choices because we're saying it's cost-benefit analysis that we should be looking rather than, say, social justice or some other criteria, normative criteria that we might find more appropriate. The second is, going back to the point I mentioned, and Martin was already also mentioning, is like, I think if you have a very strong normative sense in a particular question, this normative sense will sort of short blind you in the way you're going to look at the data, because you're already sort of looking to the data from your presumption of a normative side. So I think ideally data would be neutral. I don't think data can be neutral. Having said that, I don't think we need to go to the opposite side of this, which is the postmodernist sort of approach, which is to say there is no such thing as reality. Everything is a social construction. So statistics are just a function of social construction. And so whatever you're doing, you're measuring your own ideological perspective on your social construction. And everything there is really not reliable. So I don't think we need to go that far and start saying we shouldn't be doing this. But I think we need to be aware of, yes, data is not neutral. There are normative implications, and there are implications going in and getting out of the data. And I think we should be open about that, even if that is, less influential, because I can see that many people love the data because they think data is science, right? So if I say it's going to be raining tomorrow, people don't believe me. But if I show a graph with a uniform distribution of probabilities, and it comes from an estimation, people believe my prediction that's going to rain tomorrow. So I can see why people love data. But again, I think we have to be careful about this normative dimension on treating data.
Mm-hmm. Let's connect this question actually then with my last question actually, and which refers to the different indices of rule of law, as we mentioned also at the start of our discussion. So what do you think about those indices? There are many different indices which try to measure the rule of law somehow. So what do you think about those things out there in the science? But you know, it might have several deep impacts also on different decisions on national level. But we do know very well also on the European level. You might know also about the different proceedings of rule of law against Hungary. So what do you think about these indices?
Well, my view is that. First, the more the merrier. So I think the more indices we have of something called rule of law, the better, because that gives, that in itself shows how problematic the different indices are. So just to say in a different way, I have my own paper on indices of constitutional amendment. And what we find is that there's about 5 or 6 different indices right now existing out there. And the correlation is actually quite weak, which is amazing, because they all seem to be measuring the same. They all claim they're measuring the same thing. How come they're not correlated? So that shows there's a huge problem out there. People are measuring different things. Second, I do think there are ways to approach this. I mean, you could argue, well, maybe we should just average out these indices, or maybe we should look at, you know, different weights for the different indices. Of course, my concern again. I mean, I think there are two things that we should say. First, I think if there are more people producing these indices, is even better. So, for example, I was in a conference in France some years ago, and they were very concerned about the doing business, that the doing business was hurting France and countries with such French legal. So I said, well, why don't you do your own doing business? Because, of course, you're right in the criticism you do this doing business, just make it the alternative doing business, and then we can show where the problems are. So I would say, if other companies, institutes, foundations out there want to do a different job, I would be extremely supportive. We should definitely do different and show there are differences. Again, I'm sorry to be repetitive. I am skeptical that the European Commission should be using this. Let me just say, not because, you know, let's not bash on the European Commission all the time. So let's talk about the United States. The United States has the same problem. I mean, at some point they introduced something called the Agenda 2000 or Agenda of the Millennium, whatever it is. And so what they're doing is, they wanted to constrain the Senate, because the Senate, the way the packages of supporting third developing countries, mainly Latin American, African countries, was based on votes in the Senate. They thought that senators were being sort of, I won't use the word bribe, but, you know, persuaded by these different countries in voting these packages. So they decided to replace this by indicators, indices, exactly what you're saying. So they calculate every year a sort of indices. And then if you're above the index, the threshold, you get support from the United States. If you're below, you don't get support from the United States. So as you can imagine, this worked for some years in the beginning. But as you can imagine, this just changed the game. So the game now is about what sort of indices get into the final indicator. And the pressure is, why don't you include that? Why don't you exclude that? And of course, window dressing. Once the countries understand, hang on, if I go up a little bit here, I get money, then let's go up a little bit here. So I think that's the problem of this sort of using this for policy analysis, is because a lot of this will distort the behavior. Look, this is not very different, and Lila knows that because she's here, and those of you who have any connection to the US know, the madness in the United States about the rankings of schools, because everything is an industry about ranking. And you could argue, it's so good to rank, because now you have evidence, you have hard data, you have indicators. Yes, but then we keep most of the time manipulating and trying to influence and push this and push that. And, you know, believe me, George Mason, we just went up 11 positions in the ranking. We are so happy about that. But we all know that that does not really reflect a lot of what we have been doing here. It reflects major changes in some minor variables. So that would be my argument is, let's have more indicators. Let's have more indices. let's have more plurality of these indices for research, for discussion. Let's not use them to make really binding policy. I think it's just a bad idea.
Before we move on to other questions that I already see appearing on the chat board, that we have also our audience here, I just want to say, maybe to conclude our discussions, that we can agree that there's strength in numbers, but in order for the numbers to have strength, there actually has to be data. And one of the problems that the book also addresses is the question of bridging the gap and question of the lack of availability of data. And in my experience working for the Fundamental Rights Agency, in my capacity, I was working with the agency and compiling the annual report on the application of the fundamental rights. And there we had established protocols for the member states to report this data, also through state actors and non-state actors. And we finally saw large gaps in this data, and obviously this distorts the work that these institutions do, and also distort the findings as well. And you both are in charge of research that is directed at the jurisprudence and behavior of high courts. We kind of addressed how you approach this problem, but how can you bridge this gap of the lack of availability of data?
Right. I mean, I think we have a hard work there to be done, because I think you have three levels of problem. You have first what we could call a technical problem, that sometimes the data is not available because honestly they did not collect the data. They cannot collect the data. They cannot produce the data, and so that's a technology problem. How can we do that, and how can we, in the context of the European Union, how can we have countries collecting this data? My perception, and I don't want to sound very critical about my own native country, particularly because I'm talking here not to a Portuguese audience, because if it were a Portuguese audience, I can bash the country, no problem. People know me in Portugal already for bashing the country. But it's like, my sense in Portugal is the data we collect is because the European Union demands us to collect that data. That there's very little data we collect on our own because we want to know things about ourselves. And so in particular in the justice sector, in jurisprudence, justice, any sort of that sector, my sense is that that's because the CEPES and the Eurostat ask us the data. Anything else, we don't collect data. So that's a technology problem. We don't really collect the data. Then you have a problem of reporting. I mean, are the countries reporting the data? And my sense is that some countries in this respect are very concerned about how the data is going to be used. And so there's all sorts of incentives to misreport, underreport. It's better to say you don't have it than really show the data. And there's all sorts of complications of this level. The third level is the reaction level. And here's where I'm starting to see trends in Europe. We have France as now the leading in this, which is, as you know, there's a law. They actually enacted a law that you cannot use individual data from the courts anymore. So that means they are so upset about people studying the courts and saying certain things about the courts that you cannot, it's become, you know, an issue, because if you do it, you're violating the law. That's not just France. Canada has the same problem. They are now trying to not disclose data. So some of the data that the courts used to disclose, they now don't disclose it. And so that's going to be another problem. If these institutions feel threatened by the studies and start not disclosing data and going back in their transparency. And I sense that being real threat to the sort of research we've been doing, if that's the reaction we're going to have from the courts and the court system.
And to the measuring of judicial independence, interestingly enough as well, because if there's a lack of transparency, it reflects badly on these judicial institutions. That's a funny turn of events to which we arrived here at the end. And I think it's time for our questions now. We have heard a lot of inspiring thoughts. Before we turn to our questions on the chat board, I want to give an opportunity to our audience here. And I'm not sure if you have ever watched the Graham Norton show. It's a talk show in Britain, and they have a big red chair in front of a camera. So whoever wants to ask a question now, I'm going to allow you to sit here in the big blue chair and ask your questions of our guest if you like. Any show of hands? maybe I was too intimidating in leading up to this opportunity. So I'm just going to look at the chat board. I see 3 questions. And if you also can see them, I think they are pretty clear. If you could address them yourself, Nino, that would be great. I'm not gonna read them out loud.
Yes, I can see that. So Lila question is about essentially surprises from quantitative research. And so one of the big surprises, again, unfortunately, I mean, I'm in a different country here, but we had a study that we did for the Italian Constitutional Court. And the big surprise was that the results actually confirmed Berlusconi's claim that the court was biased against him. And that was sort of surprising because, well, we were not really Berlusconi supporters, let's put it this way. And that was sort of not really well received by many of the Italian constitutional law scholars. What happens is very simple. We look at the data and we did find out that, controlling for other variables, the invalidation of statutes was much higher under the second Berlusconi government than under the first Berlusconi government, and then any other sort of government before or after Berlusconi. Now, of course, there's a claim, which is, you could say, Berlusconi just enacts more unconstitutional laws than everybody else, given all sorts of other variables. But that's really not a very reliable explanation for what was going on. So that was a sort of a surprise. And in this case, not a very welcome surprise for those of us who did not really supported Berlusconi. But yes, we did not torture the data. The result was there and we reported it because we felt, well, it's not a happy result for us, but it has to be reported that this is what's happening. The next question is, am I efficient using the method? Well, yeah, I mean, I understand the question. I mean, if we're going to have something similar to the development in public administration in terms of approaches and scientific trends based on more qualitative or social science methods in the case of courts, I think the answer goes both ways. I think you find, as we were saying, I think in one hand, I think courts are a bit upset that these methods show things they didn't want to show. This is probably stronger in civil law countries because courts have had, in particular constitutional courts, always try to emphasize that they are very much non-political. And a lot of what this shows is that they are political. Now, that's problematic in a way because we in Europe think a court being political is a bad thing because we don't really make a big distinction. I don't know really in Hungarian if you have 2 different words, but the problem is the difference between political and partisan. And I think we try to use both words interchangeably and they mean different things. So me, coming from where I come as an economist, I'm not surprised that the courts are political and because I think the courts are necessarily political. And so I'm not upset about that. I am upset if they are purely partisan, of course, because then there's no, why do we need the courts? If this is going to be purely partisan, let the parties vote. I think in Europe, there's been some gaming with these words. And I think that's why showing that the courts can be political has been something the courts are really, really reluctant to deal with. On the other hand, going into the question, I think there are developments. I think many courts are trying to develop, even putting available online search mechanisms and providing quantitative measures that can be helpful. I mean, I think a lot of courts now provide measures on, backlogs, delays, distribution of cases, percentage of dissents, all of these things. So the courts have understood that these metrics matter and they provide them. Not sure if it's going to make a big change in terms of scholarship or in terms of way we approach this, but I do think courts are not totally against, okay?
And in the meantime,
on the basis, yeah, sure. Go ahead. There's one more question. You want me to go over that question?
Yes.
Okay. It's about which courts are most independent from other power branches. Well, that's a tough question. That's a very tough question because it depends on which indicator you use. I mean, if you pick just the rule of law indicator, which is supposed to reflect this from the World Bank, most of the European countries are up there, above 90%. So, you know, I mean, there are minor differences, but that's, I mean, you know, that's the way it is. But if you start looking at other more specific measurements, like invalidation of statutes, these rates vary deeply across Europe. And for example, just to give you an example why this is problematic, if you look at Germany, Germany does not have a very high rate of invalidation of statutes, because that's not the common practice of the German Constitutional Court, right? Every time they provide this sort of more interpretative method or reinterpret the law, which technically it's not invalidating, then you look at the statistics and it seems, oh, Germany, they don't really do, they're not very independent because they're always sort of compliant and very low overturn. On the other hand, if you look at the Spanish or the Portuguese constitutional courts, they have very high invalidation of statutes rates. They're very high. They're really into 30–40% clearly, which is very high for comparative views. But at the same time, they also have very high dissent rates, which indicates that a lot of this invalidation could be politicization of the courts and not really independence, right? And so that's why these measurements are difficult, right? So when we say, and going back to the Berlusconi case, when people say, oh, the court is independent because it's really invalidating all these statutes from governments Berlusconi, so it shows very independent for Berlusconi, right? But if the court is doing this because to satisfy the agenda of the left opposition, then this is not independence. This is actually dependence from the opposition, which is not what we mean by judicial independence. So that's why all these metrics, I would be very, very careful. And therefore, just to cite myself, I do have a paper on this where the title of the paper is called, "Can we say that the German Constitutional Court is more activist than, other than the US Supreme Court?" That's what I call the paper. And the answer is conceptually, yes, empirically, no. We cannot really answer these questions at this moment because we don't have the data to actually answer fully these questions. So I'm sorry, bad news. The answer is no, I cannot answer your question, to be completely honest.
So to end on a Socratic note, the only thing we know for sure is that we know nothing at all. This is a very good moral for our talk today about high courts examined in a global perspective. We'd really like to thank you for being with us and taking your time to talk to us about these issues. I'm going to try and turn the camera to show you our remaining audience as well and prove that they have actually been here with us the whole time. There you go. And we hope to continue this soon in a different format. Thank you very much, Nuno, once again.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you all. And it was a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I cannot be physically there. I love the city. It's been a while since I've visited Budapest, but you know, COVID and everything, this is not easy now, any sort of international traveling, as you all know at this point.
Maybe next time, but thank you nonetheless, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.